He focuses on urban health, historic preservation, and Black and minority communities. His writings and research span more than 25 years. He is the author of several major books and research studies on health, disasters, epidemics, recovery, and urban communities. He is Professor Emeritus, as I said earlier, and he has quite an extensive biography. And I do encourage you to just Google Dr. David McBride, Pennsylvania State University, and you will be amazed. So again, I am so happy to have you here today, David, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
I just want to thank everyone for giving me this time and an opportunity. I know it, we're coming out of a dark, challenging winter in terms of snow and such. So I hope everyone's in a warm place and your minds are sharp. I put together this talk to touch on 3 subjects, mainly what is a community? Secondly, what are the characteristics of disasters and such, and their impact on communities? And then third, how do we move forward? Is there a heritage of recovery? And so I to answer that question, being a historian, I look at the last century. So I'm going to touch on a lot of different challenges to communities, and we're just going to have to move through a lot of them. But hopefully by the end of the talk, we'll have some ideas with respect to what we are looking for in terms of rebuilding our communities and what's the way toward that end. Some of the ideas that I draw from, some of the thinkers that I draw from with respect to community, there's Ferdinand Tonnes. Tonnes was a German economist, sociologist, and he wrote a very famous book called Community and Society back in the early 1900s. And basically he said a community it's a collection of people, a group who share common values, who share common folklore and such. He drew the picture of a community as being distinct from the broader kind of industrial society that was unfolding at that time. And he would call those groups associational, rather impersonal. The second person that kind of we might want to think about as a thinker would be Josiah Royce. Now, he is the originator of this concept of the beloved community. He was American religious philosopher, and he enunciates this idea in the early 1900s. And his idea of community is that his idea of a beloved community is that it's a spiritual collection. It's a spiritual community. It's a very high level kind of spiritual ideal in terms of its character. And he urged that individuals need to strive to gain membership in this type of beloved community. And then last, we have Martin Luther King, and he popularizes the term beloved community, and he uses it in his sermons and such, and certainly in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. His concept of beloved community, we'll see, is very global. He has a global vision. All right, so we'll go back to that in detail later on. Again, Royce's ideas stress with respect to community, stress that a community was a spiritual entity, and it transforms the individual as they try to aspire to be a member of the spiritual community. Martin Luther King, again, had a global community, so a community view. He used the phrase a world house. Here's his pretty much the exact language. This is what you'll find when you go down to the King Center for Change in Atlanta, but this is how they describe King's idea of beloved community. It's a global vision where all people share in the wealth of the of society, and there's poverty, hunger, homelessness will not be tolerated. So let's look at some of the early disasters and how Black communities and their allies responded to these disasters. Okay, we're in a phase now with this COVID-19 where we're hopefully in the wind down stage, but we have to enter recovery. And recovery it's a lot more complex, and it takes a lot than a lot of our people know, and a lot of people in the general public. I mean, some people think, well, you just cut the lights out, you cut the light on in recovery and everything starts working as it were before the disasters. No, a disaster by its nature really cripples your society or your community, and you have to put the pieces together again. That requires a different kind of leadership, different organizations. You have to redirect resources of your community. So we're going to go through a few of the major disasters that hit Black Americans in the 20th century, beginning with tuberculosis. Then we're moving to the post-World War II civil rights period. We'll get into the so-called medical ghetto period, which is the 70s and 80s. And that's when this phrase, health disparities, medical care disparities emerges. And then we'll bring it down to Hurricane Katrina, mentioning HIV and AIDS on the side. So let's start with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death of Black Americans in the early 20th century, as all Americans. I mean, I'm sure you all have some roots that lead you to tuberculosis impact on your family or community or city. But in around 1900, 1910, 1920, it was the leading cause, right next to pneumonia, leading cause of death for Blacks. And we know that TB had ravaged Europe in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century. And then it harbors itself here in this country, and particularly in the late 1800s. And then we begin to have some progress against tuberculosis early in the 20th century. Now, tuberculosis, it is an epidemic disease. It is a so-called infectious disease, a communicable disease, these different phrases. And I thought immediately when we started getting confronted with this COVID-19, I thought immediately back to the tuberculosis era. Now, the community response to tuberculosis, it takes decades. It's not 10 weeks, 10 months. It's scientific communities across the world, looking for causes and looking for vaccines and such. And it's a very long, steep climb to the elimination of tuberculosis. And as we know, a lot of many nations, third world nations, are still in the grips of TB. It's still one of the leading causes of death, and it's still a top five cause of death in terms of global health. So what happens in terms of the Black community response to tuberculosis is that it triggers community mobilization. And the person that really takes the lead is Booker T. Washington. Before we go to Booker T, we'll just say a little bit about Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poet. And he's a famous Black poet who wrote poems that some of us know, and We Wear the Mask. And he died of tuberculosis in 1906. Young man, and as we know, a lot of young people succumb to TB at this time. And in one of his poems, I think he's kind of referring back to his problem living with tuberculosis. His poem, What's the Use? And I could not find the date of this, the exact date of publication of this poem, but it is one of, it was written by him, and it kind of suggests that he's really succumbing and kind of giving into the fact that he's not well. And the first couple of lines, what's the use of folks frowning when the way's a little rough? And then go to the second stanza. Use of folks are sighing. It's an awful waste of breath. And then the last stanza, what's the use of even weeping? Might as well go along and smile. And it's kind of where he seems like he's kind of just admitting his fate and the suffering that he's bearing with something like TB. Now, this state of mind was very widespread because you had tuberculosis was killing a lot of people, and there was very little available to reduce the rates. Now, if we had a lot of different lectures and such going on and other specialists, we can get at how tuberculosis would finally succumb to the efforts. It took medical efforts. It took building sanatoriums, open camp places, tuberculosis hospitals, dispensaries, community outreach, nursing, community nursing. Took all of these features of healthcare resources to finally get the TB numbers down. Now flip back to our current situation, and where we were trying and still try to do contact tracing and screening, isolation. That's just one feature of trying to put a lid on these infectious disease epidemics. So here we have tuberculosis running pretty rampant in the early 1900s in Black communities, rural and urban, for all different types of reasons. So Booker T. Washington, second from right, and I'm sure just about everyone on the screen knows the name and knows basically that Booker T was a great Black educator. He was considered the unofficial Negro president in the early 20th century during the time of segregation and such. And he rises to national leadership of the Black people, the Negro people, as they were called at that time. And he always had a keen eye to community health. He always, he was part of the era of the social era of progressivism, social gospel, religion. And so he believed in public hygiene, intact families. Toward that end, he gets very, wealthy and philanthropists, people like Andrew Carnegie. He gets folk like Carnegie to give him money to build a school, build many schools, and also to begin to develop health workers, because tuberculosis and poverty and this downtrodden status of Black Americans were hand in hand. So Booker T begins the famous Tuskegee Institute. I'm sure you all, again, most of us all know this story. And some of us, have studied it, and I've been down to Tuskegee, down in Macon, Alabama, but it's one of the oldest historically Black colleges. And he uses, Booker T uses that college to build a workforce of nurses, hygiene workers, social workers, some may be inclined to medicine. And here are some scenes of the Tuskegee Institute in its early decade, 1900, 1910 or so. Laboratories, the kids are learning math. Here we see young women, students learning math. So this is what I want to emphasize, is that we're seeing this rippling out into education and into philanthropy, um, they're ripping out resources to uplift the social living standards of the Black commoner. And by doing that, rid these communities of disease. And the disease, again, that was first and foremost in its negative effect on Black communities was TB. So we also have the building of a hospital down in Tuskegee, Tuskegee Hospital. It becomes part of this complex. It's a big veteran hospital that becomes a component of the Tuskegee Institute compound down there. And at that hospital, that VA hospital in Tuskegee, is the one in which the infamous experiments take place. But the history of the hospital itself is quite laudatory. I mean, and again, you have to see there's a branch that's coming out of this stream of community response to these infectious and deadly contagious diseases like TB. Now, another feature of Booker T. Washington's health movement was the start of these National Negro Health Week. And what Booker T did in the last year of his life, 1915, he started National Negro Health Week. And what it was a call to all the Black communities throughout the South and North. It was a call for them to focus on, excuse me, on public health in their neighborhoods. It was a push to get neighborhoods to have cleanup campaigns, to have health fairs, to have sessions with nurses and public health people about sanitation, hygiene. And this National Negro Health Week, which starts around 1915, it is operating to this day. It's not called National Negro Health, obviously, but it morphs into different names over the decades. And now it's part of a Minority Health Month, I believe, that's operated primarily by the federal government. Now, another important player in the response to the health crisis of Black America at the turn of the 20th century is Daniel Hill Williams, the fellow on the left. And he found, not only was he a prominent physician, and again, I'm not going to tell stories that most of us know, but he founds the Providence Hospital because he knows that the Black communities at that time needed more medical personnel to deal with the health problems that were raging in Black communities. So he founds Providence Hospital in Chicago. And it was set up specifically to train Black nurses and Black medical personnel. And so with the help of philanthropy, with the help of sometimes local government, you see Providence Hospital begin to take on a larger and larger demand for services. And the three building shots in the middle of the slide is just to give you a sense of the growth that the hospital experienced from 1891 to around 1898, and then into the 1930s. It's put in larger and larger buildings, the hospital is, because it's serving very necessary purposes for the Chicago Black communities. And this is Providence today. And I put this slide in here to remind me to mention to you all that there are many hospitals, health centers, medical schools that are an extension of these early battles with popular health crises. So maybe 10, 20 years from now, we might have some structures that are a carryover from our COVID-19 experience. We move to the 60s, and here you see a slide of the medical committee for civil rights that's happening. They're marching down in Washington, and they turn into the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and that organization is very important in the civil rights movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And what it is physicians and allied workers who are activists for civil rights legislation that affects the training of Black health professionals, the education of Black health professionals, and also the programs and resources for Black communities. So what we might be seeing here with this group is a attempt to reach a higher kind of like community ideal with respect to American medicine. In other words, American medicine, according to the civil rights activists within the medical ranks, American medicine needed to expand its service to include the people of the Deep South, to include the people in the ghettos, to include the people who were migrant workers and so. So there's that community ideal that's kind of I see at play. It's more the ideal along the lines of a Martin Luther King, pushing for a bigger globalized place for people in need of healthcare. We know that some spontaneous health centers cropped up in some of the cities. They were organized by the Black Panthers. These were health centers, not really clinics. So oftentimes they were referred to as clinics, but to get a accredited clinic is a very complex process. You have to have certain standards. You have to, for everything, from the size of the bed, where you're going to store things, how's your place line up and whatnot. But these were basically open health centers where they did some rudimentary types of health building, which meant screening for sickle cell, also providing nutritious food for needy families. Again, I'm just giving you a little taste of what I feel is a community idealism that's at play, and it's mobilizing and galvanizing and stimulating people to do things. When we get into the later 1900s, we see the emergence of that term, health disparities, and it's used to this day. When COVID began to unfold, 2.5 years ago, and within by April of 2020, by March and April, you couldn't get away from the dialogue about disparities that seemed to be emerging with respect to minority groups getting tested less, having more intense problems with COVID when they did get it. In some places, higher death rates, and a lot of that was cloaked, and still is cloaked under this phrase disparities. And we can attribute that phrase to Margaret Heckler, because she was the head of the HHS in the mid 1980s, and she said that if you read her memoirs and her letters and stuff, and matter of fact, her letter that opens up this that's on the front part of this report, 1984 report, 1985 report. She says that all of my agency heads were coming in and they were showing me this data that was saying that was revealing that Blacks were just behind in so many health measures. So she said, why don't you all get together and we'll do one big study and we'll put this out and we'll have a kind of blueprint and a benchmark to use and to work forward with. And so she commandeered the now famous Heckler Report. And the Heckler Report has chapter by chapter, subject by subject, the health disparities. It covers the health disparities that Blacks and minorities experience. Now, I'm just throwing a lot of little touches of very big issues. And the health disparities approach, which was a response to the crisis of health, high illness levels and death levels in the Black communities. This type of paradigm perspective, it carries forward through the federal government. And so attorney generals, heads of DHHS, heads of hospitals, they move forward with this perspective of we have to have extra services and extra financing for those most needy in our communities. And so we have people like Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders, Sierra KUUF, these were also attorney generals. They, each one of them under their reign took on the problem of health disparities and healthcare disparities. HIV takes on crisis level in the early 1990s, late 1980s, early 1990s. And to me, one of the most riveting stories of our battle with HIV is the story of Magic Johnson. And you all probably experienced it pretty much firsthand, out in the Michigan area. I'm sure Magic was a very popular figure back in the 90s. And when he announced that he had tested positive for AIDS, you might recall that the whole nation just went into like a deep mourning, because at that time it was believed that HIV was a certain death within a short period of time. And he actually quits basketball. He quits his profession out of fear. He quits his profession within weeks. But again, growing out of this motivation, this drive to piece together recovery and to take on the unknown, we see the turnaround that happens with Magic Johnson, and it's now part of history. And he even talks about it. He was talking about COVID and his HIV experience in the press back in March and April of 2020, when we were wrestling with the beginnings of COVID. But long story short, the fellow with him is Dr. David Ho, and David Ho is a researcher, a medical researcher, and he was very instrumental in discovering the protease inhibitors that became used to treat AIDS, a so-called cocktail of antibiotics and antivirals that were put together in the mid-1990s. And what amazingly, a lot of people who died from AIDS because of the impact of the disease, gradually they began to have longer and longer survival rates, and to the point now where they are really very close to normal lifespans. And here's Magic Johnson at a 20th anniversary in 2011 of his 20th anniversary of his announcement of having tested positive for AIDS. Here he is with Dr. Ho, and this is online. It's great to see. You can see it on YouTube. But basically, they reminisce, and I think Dr. Ho treats Magic Johnson to this day. So instead of being a statistic, Magic Johnson's lived a long life. He's been very instrumental in community uplift, businesses, enterprise, and gifts. This is a page from his Magic Johnson Foundation, which you don't need to read the details. But he's alive and well and a very important, valuable member of our society. Continuing this tradition of pushing for health at a higher level and including more of the needy, and we have Dr. Jerome Adams, who was one of the most recent Surgeon Generals, and David Hatcher, he was a prior Surgeon General as well. All of them pushed programs that were targeted toward minority communities and Black communities. Last, I'll just touch on Hurricane Katrina. This was another challenge to Black community stability, not only in the eye of the storm. I mean, not only within New Orleans, but it affected some 15 million people. This hurricane did, and destroyed tens of thousands of houses, 1,800 lives lost. And even a year after Katrina, less than half the population could return to their homes and such. Now, Katrina is part of our lives, most of us. And some of us, I'm sure, have, again, personal connections to that area, to that event. So I'm just jogging our memories and such with respect to Katrina. The main point I want to make, though, getting back to this community drive, this drive to rebuild, and what's underneath that drive. The response to Katrina, as years ensued from the event, tens of thousands of volunteers and thousands of NGOs went down to the Gulf Coast and rebuilt, helped rebuild houses and businesses and schools, and it's going on to this day. And so a lot of what was lost is being rebuilt. And also, what's really interesting about New Orleans and these rebuilding projects is a lot of them are incorporating sustainability features. We all know that COVID-19 has been running a kind of just a different course within certain minority populations. And again, I don't want to get into a lot of detail. You all know a lot of these things. But what we're interested in is the response. And we have seen from the very beginnings of COVID, we've seen Black community centers and churches serve as best they can. We've seen a lot of Black medical personnel staff COVID vaccine and testing sites in Black communities, some of them established from scratch. And this is not to overshadow any other groups that have been doing likewise, but I'm just focusing again on this community spirit and the community outreach that occurs with respect to healthcare in Black communities when these epidemics and disasters hit. Also, in response to COVID-19, many of the healthcare agencies have been using Black personnel to reach the most needy community sections in various cities. So where does this leave us with respect to the community question community themes that I raised at the beginning of my talk? Again, Royce, he stressed the individual. The individual has to strive to be a member of a high ideal spiritual community. Martin Luther King, I think his view is more lateral one. I think he stresses a world, a house idea of community. I think what I'm want to end with is saying that instead of emphasizing, let's say, a racial heritage or a particular ethnic heritage with respect to community healthcare and community health and recovery, I would say we need to think in terms of a community heritage, not a racial heritage. And I would like to see in our recovery projects more emphasis on community. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the recovery that programming that's going on now, it's targeted for very specific groups, K through 12, or people with certain specific conditions, certain businesses, this, that, and the other. But we also need to think about, we have to kind of rebuild the tissue of community. And that will be an assurance over the long haul as we face new crises. And with having said all of that, I'm very curious as to any comments or questions that anyone has. And Joan, I'm sure you're watching the clock, so we can, maybe we have time for some.
Oh, yes, we definitely have time for questions. Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful, and it's a great overview, and I'm sure we've all